Hello, this is Rochelle, and we are going to go over some parts of factoring. And just to remind you, factoring is when you take a polynomial like this in standard form, that where all the terms are added together, and you rewrite it as a polynomial in factored form, or in other words, where it's the product or two things multiplied together equaling this thing. Same polynomial in standard form. So we're just going to focus here on finding the greatest common factor and factoring it out of a polynomial. So if we want to find the greatest common factor of these terms, it's the largest monomial, so the largest single term that evenly divides each term of the polynomial. So it evenly divides. In other words, there aren't any, there's nothing left in the denominator, really. That would be a variable. So if I want to list out the factors here of this first term, I would have 5 times 5 times x times x times x times x times x. That's in factored form. And that's the monomial. Wow, that's funny. This one would be 5 times 4, or 2 times 2, and then there would be 4 x's multiplied together. Here we'd have 5 times 6, which is times 2 times 3, and we only have 2 2's. So the greatest common factor are the factors that they all have in common. So they all have an x in common, they all have another x in common. But since this one only has 2 x's, it only has those 2 x's in common. Here, in terms of numbers, they all have a 5 in common. So the greatest common factor would be 5 times x, or 5x squared. So it's whatever we can divide into. So I could divide each of these by 5x squared and have no fraction remaining. So if we want to find the greatest common factor here, we could do the same thing. We have, 18x squared y to the third, which would be 2 times 9, which is 3 times 3. We have 2 x's and 3 y's. 30x to the third y would be 5 times 6, which is 2 times 3. I guess it would have been 6, And then 3 x's and 1 y. Then 81x to the fifth y squared. That's 9 times 9. Or 3 times 3 times 3 times 3. 5 x's and 2 y's. So here, when we're looking for what is in common, I guess I'm switching colors here. I see that they all have a 3 in common. This one doesn't have a second 3, so we don't have that in common. And this one down here doesn't have a 2, so they don't have that in common. And there's no 5 in the other two. There are, looks like 2 x's in common, and then 1 y in common. But again, we don't have any more x's up here, so my greatest common factor would be 3 times x times y, or 3x squared y. So if we want to factor those out of a trinomial here, or a polynomial, here we have these same factors right here. They're just being added and subtracted. We've already figured out that the greatest common factor is 5x. And let me write that just a little bit lower here. Is 5x squared. Gosh, I said I was going to write it lower, and then I did not. So now what we're going to put here is we're basically going to divide 5x squared by this, and we're going to write what's remaining, which would be 5. And then if I subtract the exponents here, I would have x to the third. Or you could think of it as what is remaining once I take that greatest common factor out, which is 5 times x and then times 2 more x's, which is my 5x to the third. Same thing here. If I divide this by 5x squared, I'm going to have what is remaining up here, which I see 4 and x squared. If I divided these two, I would get 4. There's a plus sign here, so I'm following that plus sign through. Excuse me, I'm going to keep my colors the same. And then if I subtracted those exponents, it would be x squared. Now I have a minus here, so I'm going to keep that minus. Goodness, that's not the color I wanted. Keep that minus. And I see what I have left here is a 6, but I also see that if I divided this by 5x squareds, the x squareds would cancel, and I would just be left with minus 6. So that is what it looks like when I factor out the common factor. So let's just practice that a few times. So here, at some point, we do want to get used to trying to find those common factors by just looking here. Now, 18, I'm just going to kind of write it over here as 2 times 9. 30 is what? 2 times 15? I don't know. Maybe that's helpful. And then 81, I know is that 3, 3, 3, and 3. And then this is 2 times 3 times 5. And this is 2 times 3 times 3. So there's really only a single 3 in common. I'm going to go ahead and factor out a negative. It's not necessary. Now, I should just be able to look at my x terms and just pick the one that has the smallest exponent. Since they all have x's, they all have an x squared in common. Same thing with the y's. I see that I have y to the third y and y squared. The lowest one is just that y. Then what I do again is I go ahead and I divide by that common factor and I see what's left. I know that negative 18 divided by negative 3 is 6. I know that x squared divided by x squared is nothing. And y squared divided by y, one of the y's will cancel out and I'll just be left with y squared. Same thing here. If I divide by negative 3x squared y, a negative 30 divided by a negative 3 is going to be a positive 10. The y's are going to cancel. And in this case, I have 3 x's on top, 2 x's on bottom, so I'll just be left with an x. Here again, I'm going to divide by negative 3, x squared y. And I know that 81 divided by negative 3 is negative 27. Then I'm going to have x to the third y because I subtracted those exponents, or I could just think of it as I have 5 x's on the top and 2 y's on the top, 2 x's on the bottom and 1 y, which leaves me with just x cubed and a y. This one's a little bit easier. I know that 8 will go into 24. So I'm going to factor out an 8, and I'm going to look at my smallest y here. So now I'm just going to have to divide by 8y squared in both of these. And I know that 24 divided by 8 is 3. And I know that this will be y to the third. Now it looks like everything cancels out here, and sometimes people want to make that 0. But remember, if I take 8 divided by 8, I'm actually going to get a 1. So this will be minus 1. And let's finish up by these last two, which will help us with our next lesson. And that is, this is a little bit tricky, but the common factor, these are each the terms. And the common factor is this thing that's in parentheses. So I'm going to factor that entire thing out. And if I divide everything by that, it's going to cancel out. So I'm just going to be left with my 2x squared, my minus 3x, and my plus 9. And then I would want to see if I could factor that. And we're going to talk a little bit about factoring that in another lesson. But I'll just leave it like that for right now. Here, again, we have our x minus 3 that is in common. And what that would leave us, if I divide by the x minus 3 on both of these, would just be 5x and minus 2. So that is how we factor out the greatest common factor.